University, which is in St. John's, Newfoundland. And I have, I'm not specifically focused, my work is not specifically focused on cults, but I'm interested in identity formation and transformation, so how we come to know ourselves. And cults became interesting to me because of the amount of ego destruction that people can experience in a cult, and also the experiences of transitioning and then trying to find a new sense of self or create a new sense of self. So that's where my interest has taken me, but I'm hoping that some of the work that I've done is helpful to those of you who do work with people who are leaving cults. Just to begin, I wanted to say that the work that I'm referring to is a narrative analysis. I gathered the stories of individuals who had left social groups of significance, and their leavings were momentous. And these, of course, are very big words, and we have to define them, but I didn't define them. The people who I interviewed defined them. So they had to, in order to have met the criteria for my study, they needed to have felt that they had left a social group that was significant to them. It was fundamental to how they understood themselves, and that the leaving from that group had been a momentous experience. It had completely altered their world and their sense of self. So in my particular study, I had individuals who had left cults. About 25% of the study were individuals who had left cults. Also people who had left an outlaw motorcycle gang, people who spoke about transitioning from male to female, female to male, people who had come out as gay or lesbian after having lived a life of a very heterosexual life with boy-girl, white picket fence kind of scenario. So coming out sort of midlife when it was a big deal. But it was a very different experience than sort of coming into something and discovering yourself when you're 17, or having a momentous change when you're 54. So it's so I had quite a range of social groups that were represented. I interviewed everyone 2 times, and so I had 16 people and 2 sets of narratives for each individual. And in previous conferences at ICSA, I have presented information around the process that the individuals experienced as they left the group. I didn't want to talk about that today. What I wanted to talk about today is the therapy narratives. So when they talked about the therapy that they received or any type of support that they received from a helping professional, that's the information that I took out. Those are the stories that I looked at for the presentation today. The first thing that I wanted to say was that therapy is helpful. And maybe that's kind of a no-brainer, but I think it's important to say. These individuals all found therapy of one form or another to be helpful. 88% received professional help, so that's help from a psychologist, social worker, therapist, somebody who's trained to provide counseling. 75% received paraprofessional help, so went to a support group of some sort, mutual aid group, that sort of thing. And 63% received both, and 100% received one form or the other. So all of them received some sort of help, and I think that's an important point to make. For those that, of the 14, so I interviewed 16 people, of the 14 that received professional help, 5 of them said that they received help specifically for issues related to leaving their social group. The others received, they said that leaving the group was one of several issues that they approached, went to therapy for. And the others included things like depression, anxiety, dealing with child abuse, domestic violence, a whole range, addictions was a big one. So there was a whole range of other issues which were or were not necessarily connected to leaving the group. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive categories. Some of them had several issues. These are the themes that came up from the groups, from my participants. And I'm going to go through each one just a little bit. I'd like to do more, but I'm just going to go through it overall. And I'm going to try to give you some direct narrative from the people themselves so you get a quotation. So these are the reasons, no, these are the things, these themes are related to the experience of receiving help and the things that were considered to be helpful. So the first one is working through trauma and lingering issues. And this trauma could have been related to membership in the group itself. It could also be related to the actual leaving process. Lingering issues were things like dealing with, say, abuse that happened in the group, or in some cases, trauma that had happened prior to joining the group. So they had certain experiences, they joined a group. When they left, they needed to go back and deal with some of those things that may have led them to join a group in the first place. So this is a quotation from an individual. Actually, he's from Newfoundland, although he didn't live in Newfoundland at the time. But so he said, I had come from A, which was his initial social group, and I had a glimpse of B, which was his new group, and then I got thrown back into A with this new understanding of who I could be or who I was as a person. I had thought by this point that I was strong enough to manage and negotiate my father and the community which I came from and things along those lines. In the fall, when I did go back into my community, it was probably the first time I had been back there since my mother died. It had been a messy, messy situation. It led to a confrontation, and it led to floodgates of a whole bunch of things opening and a whole bunch of things which I didn't have the capacity to process or deal with, and I attempted to die. So it was a point where everything just fucked. This child abuse, all that stuff. A lot of the child abuse issues I didn't even fully realize. I didn't know the extent. I knew I came from a turbulent environment, but I didn't know that I was sexually abused. I didn't know a whole bunch of things. Following this confrontation and this whole thing where he himself, that'd be his father, put a lot of things out there, things which I didn't remember. He then confronted me and said, you're the reason that I did this to you. You're the reason that I did this to your mother. A whole bunch of other horrible things happened, and that day I attempted to take my life. So this individual grew up with unbelievable child abuse, and his mother was also severely abused, and his father is now blaming him for that abuse. That was one of the lingering issues that he had to come to deal with in therapy. So when I say lingering issues, they're not minor. They're pretty significant. Discovering that it's not my fault. As we've heard many times today, this whole idea of if you leave the group, something bad is going to happen. Or also some ideas like, why did I join that group in the first place? How could I be so stupid? We've had these thoughts come up today already. But that's one of the things that therapy has been very helpful for some individuals. I think one of the big things that my counselor did for me is she told me it's not my fault. I think that's one of the key things that came from that. Well, the other people supported me, and she doesn't undermine that. They never looked at the issues and the stuff that I was dealing with. And my counselor, she supported me directly. She confronted the issues I was dealing with and helped me realize that I had such a minimal role or control in any of that, that I was the vulnerable one, and that I had very little power, and it wasn't my fault. I think that's probably the key difference, and that helped push me to a new level as well, that I finally probably believed that I wasn't responsible. So while others supported and nurtured and tried to push me and help and support me, I think she, my counselor, had done all of that and then some. I think she probably gave me a new level of realization or a new lens to look at my whole new experience, to look at my whole experience. Having the pain acknowledged. some individuals spoke about their support after they left the group. Individuals would say, well, thank God you got out. And they'd be very encouraging and supportive, but they didn't always see that being in the group had been painful, or that perhaps leaving had been painful. So having a therapist who can acknowledge that pain was considered very helpful. The other thing about my therapist that made a difference, when we did talk a bit about the sexual abuse, she was the first person that ever said to me around this whole abuse thing, you've really been hurt. She was the first person that really recognized or said what I wanted. I was longing for someone to say to me, which was to recognize that I had been hurt by all of this. Nobody had ever said that before. We've talked about this before too in other presentations today, but talking with a professional who's knowledgeable and respectful of past and present group memberships. I think the thing that is, I think that we're all trying to say here one way or another is that our membership in these groups can be ambivalent, because there are good times and there are some horrible times. And when you make a decision to leave, then you're sort of tipping the scales and saying, the situation here is thus that I want to leave. I think that it's going to be better outside. Not everybody has a choice about leaving, some people are kicked out. But having a professional who is very knowledgeable about the group, but at the same time respectful, and at the same time can key into that ambivalence that you may feel, was really key. Let's see what page number I have there. I've got two. One is about when it doesn't happen. One sense that we had was that our counselor didn't understand where we were, and it actually made things worse in terms of the feeling that we didn't belong and were not connected. So most of what this therapist did wasn't actually very helpful because they couldn't connect. There is a particular researcher, Wright, who writes the following. He says, some elements of membership undoubtedly make lasting and favorable impressions upon defection. Post-involvement evaluation of memberships is essentially a shifting process in which favorable events and experiences are separated out from what is later perceived as wrong, immoral, or theologically adrift. As a result, one will find voluntary defectors defending certain aspects of the group while criticizing others. This kind of selectivity and separation of the more valued aspects of one's membership gives an indication of careful reflection on part of the individual. So it's almost seen as not just a necessary part of the process, but kind of an end result too, that you're able to pick up those parts. You can sift through those experiences and not see that experience as black or white, like you were often told to within the group, but to start to see those nuances and to say, this is a piece that I liked, and this is a piece that I'm actually going to take with me into my current understanding of self. A gentle challenging of existing worldviews and thinking patterns. Again, we're getting into those nuances and moving away from black and white. One individual had seen a Jungian therapist, and she said, Jungian therapy really encourages one to hang on to the paradoxes. Don't try to fix them, just live with the paradox. And that helped me work through a lot of the stuff from the old church, because it was like some things might be true, but I was allowed to say, I'm not sure about that yet. The professional's ways of being. It was interesting how certain characteristics of the professional came up again and again. Warmth, ability to listen, those are all good characteristics. But one characteristic that kept coming up was the being real. So the person was real. They seemed authentic, unconditionally accepting, and here's one that surprised me, but they had energy. And one individual said, you come out and you're so exhausted, and you've got so much to do, and the last thing you need is a therapist who does not have any energy. So you need a therapist who will say, we can do this, let's do this, here's something. And it just in their whole presentation has energy. And that can be hard as a therapist because you often start to feel that you take on sort of the emotional presentation of your client. But as a therapist, to sort of move beyond that and provide that energy because they don't have enough is an important piece. And I think that was one very unique finding, I think. Attending to practical matters. There's so much that happens when you're leaving any kind of group, not just cults. And there's a whole, say, if you're leaving your spouse because of domestic violence, this kind of thing can happen where you have little or nothing. So you're doing all these leaving simultaneously. You're leaving your home, you're leaving your environment, sometimes you're leaving your children, sometimes you're leaving your schools, your jobs, all sorts of things. So all of these leavings become sort of nested together. So that increases the momentousness of leaving the group. But there's also the practical matters that become associated with that. So, getting new ID maybe, or getting a CV, somebody was mentioning getting a resume, finding a place to live, finding a job. All of these things are extremely important. And if a therapist ignores that and sees their job as only attending to sort of the psychological aspects or the emotional aspects, they can miss the boat. It's all of it. You have to look after all of those aspects. And as one person said, when they cared for, say for my dog, and cared that my dog had food or that my dog was looked after, I knew that they cared for me. Or if they cared for whether my children had food, I interpreted that as them caring for me. So it is a way to express warmth and caring as a therapist, but it's also so necessary. Dealing with negative emotions related to past membership. Again, this is mentioned in other presentations as well, but the ones that came up here in particular were grief and loss and loneliness. So those were the three big ones. They were the negative emotions. And there's, of course, hurt and all of that, but those were kind of the top three. And the last point there, helping with the transition, helping with this identity transition. This is interesting when you think about, and this is sort of the premise that I based all my research on, that we understand ourselves sort of in two ways. We see ourselves as our personal self, which is our sense of self as unique from others. And then we identify our social selves and how we are like others. Are you okay? So, I'm a woman like many of you. I'm interested in this topic like many of you. I'm probably sort of in your age bracket, and so on. So we share all of those things. And yet I'm different in very significant ways. So that's the one way that we see our social selves. But we also get to know ourselves through our contact with others. And if we're suddenly losing all those people who helped shape who we are and define who we are, and now we're outside of that group, how are we going to find those mirrors, those people that can help us discover who we are? Because it's often a discovery at this point. And so the therapist plays a key role in being a mirror and saying, I see that you're good at this, I see that you might like this, and making those kinds of comments. And sometimes they land and sometimes they don't. But the purpose of them is to say, I see this. I see that this is part of you. And it provides that social aspect that may be missing. Does that make sense? So when I was looking at these stories and looking at the topic of the conference, are there things about leaving a cult that might be different than some of the things that I discovered in my research? So when I think about things like good outcomes, what are they if you're leaving a cult? Are they the same or are they different from people who are doing other forms of leaving? Presenting needs and concerns, are they different? Are they distinctive? The skills and knowledge of the therapist, could any therapist do this? Or should it be a therapist who's particularly trained in helping people leave cults? And is the process in leaving a cult unique, or is there a kind of a universal process that we all might go through if we're leaving a social group of significance? So these are the questions that I wondered. And maybe we can have a discussion about it at some point. So these are things that I'm going to, this slide was supposed to be earlier, but anyway. So when I came to the therapy narratives, and when I analyzed them, I was looking at a couple of things. What is being said? So what is the actual content? How is the narrative told? I'll get to that bit more about that in a minute. And why was it told that way? So when I took out these interviews and I looked at the stories contained in them, I'm thinking, okay, what is the actual content? How did they tell that story? And why did they tell that story? In telling it that way, what is being communicated? What is being conveyed? So, getting back to my 4 questions now. What are the needs? Are the needs of someone leaving a cult different than the other needs that I described? There's the fundamentals of food, shelter, clothing, employment. A fundamental need of belonging, having social supports, friendships, and community. Mental health impacts related to group membership, which could include trauma, abuse, loss and grief, anxiety, depression, and addictions. This is for all of my sample. And yet you can see that it's pretty consistent with leaving a cult. In terms of identity, there's the multiple and simultaneous identity transitions related to leaving. I think this is where we might see some differences, that the identity formation, transformation needs might be a lot higher because of the cult's very intentional desire to destroy one's sense of self. So now there are other groups that do that too. You could argue that the military does that. You could argue that certain careers do that, like the priesthood. You could argue that motorcycle gangs or membership in that could also have an element of ego destruction. But what I saw in my sample was that those who had left cults had a greater ego destruction. So that was where I saw some differences. The skills and knowledge of the therapist, knowledge of the specific group would be important. The language of the specific group would be important. The means and degree of ego destruction, so knowing how that happened might be important. And the implications of leaving on one's family and social relations. This is where I think this is the extra knowledge that would be needed if you're working with individuals leading cults. I think that even when I was doing the interviews, like if I was going to interview somebody, interviewed somebody who left the Jehovah's Witnesses, I spent a long time getting ready for that interview, learning the language, knowing what an apostate is, knowing what the process of being, cast out would look like, what do they shun, do they not? I got all of that language, all of that information before I did the interviews. So I learned a lot about the Jehovah's Witnesses, about Old Order Mennonites, about outlaw motorcycle gangs, but I did all of that ahead of time because the language, I think, and knowing the language is very important, because you don't want to have someone then say to you, well, like when they talk about apostates or talk about shunning, you think, what's that? And then you sort of disrupt the flow of their narrative. These particular things, like trauma-informed practice and working around issues of grief and loss, I think any good therapist should know those things, and how to deal with disassociation, for example, those kinds of things. I'd like to think a good therapist would know those things. I do think that there's a distinction between voluntary and involuntary leavings. I think a therapist should know what that is and how that would play out. And I think it's important that they have knowledge of the disengagement process. So, I know, Arthur, you talked about process in your presentation, which I'm not going to talk about a lot today, but in my research I discovered a process as well. I sort of had this question whether a process would exist, and I think it does, and that individuals leaving social groups of significance go through similar social processes that are not unique to leaving a group, or leaving a cult necessarily. And because the same process exists, and mine looks a little bit different than yours, and we're not going to squabble about that, because I'm looking at somewhat different things too, in terms of how identity, changes in identity aligns with the chronology. But all I wanted to do with this slide was indicate that this was the process for all 16. And we've got 25% that left cults, but they went through a similar process. So, like I said, I won't get into it too much, but I will focus on this part here, the new identity formation, because that's where the therapists were most often involved. So this is the very last square on the previous slide. So here, when we look at this final stage, when you're looking at new understandings of self, this is where the therapist was most often involved. And some of the characteristics that they talked about was this need to take personal responsibility for their own development, making peace with one's former self, and perhaps also with one's former group. That doesn't mean forgiving them. That also means maybe not even forgiving yourself for something that you may have done, but making peace with it. Claiming a new identity by joining a new social group. Lots of people talked about that. Or creating a new social category. So when I asked someone like, who are you? They might say, I'm an ex-Mennonite. And they have the Mennonite in their new understanding. So it was very interesting how people describe themselves and the labels that they used. Some people said, I was this and now I'm a Christian. And it's like, so they've gotten into a new group now. Another common characteristic was the changing of external dress, behavior, and or name to mark the internal changes. So it's like, this is the new me, and I'm going to have that be identified some way. So dressing your own way, not dressing the way that you were told to dress. Many had got a new name and behaved in different ways, and in fact, or got something like a tattoo or something that sort of marked this, an external marker for an internal change. And they talked about validation that they received from others, that they could recognize that they no longer belonged to that group. So when I interviewed the former priest, he said, I love it when people, don't know that I was a priest and can't tell that I was one. Some of the common experiences when they get to this stage is that they identified feeling happy, having an absence of anger, guilt, or fear. But there was pain associated with close friends and family not being happy for them and or not accepting their new self-understandings. and or maybe not being happy with them, having left the group. I got some of that with the individuals who were transgendered. It was like one woman's mother basically disowned her and said, "You are my son and not my daughter, get out." So having to, that was very painful, obviously. And then when you look at these characteristics and experiences, what's the meaning then? When we look at these narratives, what's the meaning of what's being told? And I think one of the things that they were trying to communicate is all's well that ends well. I'm happy with where I am now, and I can see that part of where I am now is because of this group membership, so that even though it was horrible or even though it was whatever, I'm glad where I am today. So another message was I'm a survivor. I made it through. I did this. Another one that was interesting was arriving where one started. So it was like, you know what? I remember a long time ago, I used to like this. You're talking about doing your art.
Yeah.
That's very much, that theme was very much there. People picked up interests that they had long abandoned, friendships that they had abandoned, so just sort of picking up, and so it wasn't so much a brand new self, but sort of going back and finding those elements of oneself that you feel like you've sort of lost along the way. And another thing is the strong message is that the individual self cannot be denied. So in terms of what is a good outcome, are there differences between the social groups that I looked at? They all spoke about a good outcome having this congruency. So who I feel I am as an individual is reflected by the social groups that I belong to. So if I feel like a female on the inside, then I want to look like one, I want to belong to the female social group. So that was a very key finding, and I think, I don't want to undermine this because I think what also came out throughout the whole research was the incredible pain that we live with if we don't have that congruency. And many people spoke about it almost in very dire circumstances, like if they couldn't get that congruency, then they would rather die. And many of them spoke about death. 3 had attempted suicide. 3 were they're fearful of their lives because of the group that they were leaving, including the guy who left the outlaw motorcycle gang. So that's 6 out of 16 that talked about very real fears of dying, either by suicide or by murder. But the other thing that they also spoke about is this sort of death of self. That had I stayed in that group, I just would have been a robot, or I was kind of at the point that if I had stayed any longer, I would be gone. I would felt like any remnant of myself would no longer be there. Many talked about the importance of being able to control the timing and pace of the disengagement process to the absolute extent that they could. And they couldn't always control everything, but to the extent that they could. And that's very important. And that's a good finding in terms of what therapists, how therapists can, what they can offer as well. But the optimum amount of control is preferable. So these feelings, those are good outcomes as well. Now, I'm just at a point now, I've taken it's 1:15, and I was assuming I had about 45 minutes, so should I wrap it up now, or, because you're going next, right?
4 or 5 minutes.
Pardon me?
4 or 5 minutes.
For 5 more minutes? Okay, all right. This was something that I'm just going to talk about, and I'm going to leave it you with a bit of wonder so you can ponder it. When I talked to these 16 individuals, there were certain things that I could see that aligned. Like I could see that there was a process that was emerging. I could see that there were themes emerging around therapy. What I discovered when I looked at the stories because I'm looking, remember, and I'm paying attention to how the story is told. These stories of leaving were told in kind of one of three ways. And I think what happens is that when we tell a story, we grasp onto what I call a canonical form. There's ways of telling a story that were familiar to us, and we grab onto that when we're trying to make sense of our experience. So, for example, once upon a time, they lived happily ever after. That's a form of a story, of a fairy tale. And what surprised me was we tell stories as a way of making sense of our experience. But why did they tell them in three different ways? I'm going to go through each of these. Some people told their stories like a bildungsroman. So if you, this is a form of literature. Dickens was good for this. Jane Eyre was good for this. You talk about this person who sort of goes through life, and you have a slow emergence of the self. And you don't really see the significance of those little events until you look back and say, oh, I'm a long ways away from where I started. One of the characteristics of this type of story is a desire. It's a desire to find your way. It's a desire to make it in the world. And there can be tensions between these desires and how, tensions in terms of these desires and how they need to be resolved. So the past and present selves are connected in this continuous arc. So when we talk about disengagement from social groups, how some people told that story is, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then my child was born, and then this happened, and then this happened. And then I looked back, and I had left the Jehovah's Witnesses 5 years ago. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the last time I went to their, that was the last time. And then, so it's like this slow emergence. It's like, okay. And it's not to say that they had any less suffering, but it was told in this particular way. Then there's a group of people that told it like a conversion narrative. It was rapid, intense, and suddenly, boom, I left. Saturday morning I was in the group, Saturday night I was in a women's shelter and I had left. And it's kind of this one event that dissects the person into their experience into before and after. And there's a pre-self and a post-self, and there's a specific point at which that decision is made. So they say, tell me about leaving the group, and they'll say, it all happened on this, and they'll give me the exact details of what that specific event was. And they'll talk about themselves as, well, when I was in the group, I was often a negative, and now I'm a positive. It's a positive thing. So there's this shift from pre to post, and it's often precipitated by suffering as opposed to the previous type, which is desire. Again, in the interest of time. And the final form was what I call you got to get in to get out. And 6 people in my sample used this type of form, and it was these 6, not surprisingly, were ones who had chosen to enter the group in the first place, and now they've left the group. So in this particular narrative, they talk about how the group fit, and they had this personal and social congruence, and then their experience in the group was such that that fit no longer was there. And then they left the group. And that fit is no longer there, either because the group has changed or because they've changed. So in the case of the group, for example, there was an example would be people who leave, the nuns who left after Vatican II. It was like, that's not what the group that I belong to. This is so they leave because the group has changed. In this kind of narrative, the individuals spend a lot of time defending why they joined in the first place. And they have to explain why they joined and explain why they're leaving. And they really like who they are now, so they have to say, I couldn't have been who I am today without having been in this group. This is my last slide. So the question is, if you have a similar disengagement process and you have it's told in different ways, how do we make sense of that? And I think when we look at how the story is told, it tells us a lot about how that individual positions themselves within that process. So how much agency did they have? How much awareness over the those who told the buildings Raman had a slow awareness. Those who had told like a conversion experience had a sudden quick awareness. So that's how they explain those shifts. And some of them just had experiences that were really quick versus really slow. Like the person who left within 24 hours, she had a threat on her life. It had nothing to do with her. It was like, if I don't get out today, I might never get out. Each narrative type helps the individual make sense of identity transitions and this congruency or not. So they're, again, like I said, they're choosing a narrative form that's out there. And we, if you look at things like AA in the 12 steps, that's a narrative form of, I hit rock bottom, I have to be with my group, or I can't stay sober. If you take a harm reduction model, it's a very different kind of narrative. And they both look at addictions. This is my point here is, when I ponder this, I think, what is the role of therapists in not only helping people tell their stories, but providing them or making them aware of forms within which to tell that story that are broader. And I think that if we can expand these forms, we can make these experiences richer, and we can get more true to what that experience was. So I think we're latching on to forms that are familiar, that doesn't, and they're the best fit, but I'm not sure, they're the best fit with what we've got, but I'm not sure they're necessarily the best fit. So that's where I will leave it for now. Yes?
Catherine, these three descriptors, the three different styles of narrative, are these a product of your research, or are they based on references from other scientists?
They were there in my research. So they were there, and then from there I looked at other forms. And
so when you say they were there, so that
they were
based on bibliography, like references from other...
No, they were there in the data.
Okay.
When I analyzed the stories, that's how they were being told.
All right.
There was three
so
types.
These are your own definitions of narratives? Or?
Well, once I saw that they were there, then I went and looked elsewhere. And there is research on conversion narratives. There is research on how people narrate their themselves, and they're changing themselves. But I didn't do that first. I first wanted to see what was there.
Okay, thank you.